So with the two remaining sessions that we have today, talking about climate change and national security, we're going to pivot a little bit. We've been talking about the global security environment, the role of policy making, the importance of collaboration across nations, nationally, how to build climate resilience, a climate security plan. With the remaining two sessions, we're going to be digging a bit more into the themes of what is the role of innovation? What is the role of the financial markets? Sort of a little bit of a return to kind of the Chris Sacca discussion in terms of what's happening as it relates to the private sector and what kind of a role can those domains play in ultimately moving things in the direction of climate solutions. So our next panel, called Climate Solutions, will be a look at spaces largely outside of government, business, finance, innovation, and communities and the role that they can play in driving collective climate action. Moderating this session is Erika Karp, Executive Managing Director, Chief Impact Officer with Pathstone. She joins the Pathstone team from Cornerstone Capital Group, which was acquired by Pathstone in 2021, the sustainable and impact investment advisory firm she founded in 2013. Erika founded Cornerstone Capital Group to bring the disciplines of finance, economics, and sustainability to bear in pursuit of a more regenerative and inclusive form of capitalism. Over the course of her 25-plus years on Wall Street, she developed a deep belief in environmental, social, and governance (ESG) analysis as a critical input to investment decision-making. So, Erika, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My only regret is that we're not together in person, because really I love Jackson Hole so much. Let me say for a start, we will not have a healthy global economy unless we have a healthy capital markets, unless we have healthy financing, unless we have a more regenerative and inclusive form of capitalism. And we have a crisis in capitalism now. So the trust in our institutions, corporate, financial, regulatory, really has been damaged over the last couple of decades. And when it comes to climate solutions, what people need to understand is there is no place to hide if we don't get this right. So when we're talking about droughts and wildfires and water scarcity and the extinctions of the species, thousands a year, all right, when we're talking about mass migrations and conflict and obviously military supply chains in jeopardy, like, again, there's no place to hide. And when it comes to systemic financial risk, again, this is every industry, every economy, every country. So we got a lot of work to do. And it's going to take some vision, and it's going to take a lot of imagination. And by the way, on that imagination thing, Einstein reminded us that imagination is more important than knowledge. And logic might get us from point A to point B, but imagination can get us everywhere. So we have what we need to meet the challenges. We have the capital out there. We just have to move it. We have the technologies. We just have to execute. So in any case, the experts we have on this panel, the three of you, cover like everything, but that's exactly what we need, right? An interdisciplinary plan so we can go out there and get it done. So I'm going to ask each of you just literally a minute, self-introduce in terms of, your function, the most important things that you do, and then please add on what would be your aspiration? What would be the future state that would be awesome? So Stephanie, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to be here today. So my name is Stephanie Tedy, and I am the head of strategic philanthropy for Bank of the West. I've been with Bank of the West for a little over 11 years now and new to the team within about 6 years. So we are dedicated to providing strategies around climate solutions. And my aspiration would be that we find a way to come together through partnerships and collectiveness to help combat the changes that we need within our society.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Lin.
Hi, my name is Jiang Lin. I'm the Net Simon Presidential Chair in China Energy Policy at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and a staff scientist in the International Division. My research interest really covers broader clean energy transition and climate change, etc. My aspiration, as Eric nicely teed up for us, we have the money, we have the technology. My aspiration that we don't miss the ball. We have to seize the moment to take action now to save the world for our future generations.
Perfect. Okay, and Carly.
Great, thank you. My name is Carly Anderson. I'm a chemical engineer and partner at Prime Movers Lab, a very proud co-sponsor of this event. For those we haven't met, we're a venture firm that invests in breakthrough science companies that have the ability to transform billions of lives across the building blocks of civilization. You know, we don't do software. We got Facebook in the last 20 years instead of fusion and flying cars. We want to change that. If I think about our aspirations for the future, it's that we both think tactically with the technologies we have to deploy what exists where we can, but also strategically and use that imagination you mentioned, Erika, to think through like how can we really create the future that we want to live in, that we are absolutely convinced is going to be even better than what we have today.
Okay, thank you each. Okay, so we can start from top down, macro down, or we can start from bottom up. But Carly, since you are a chemical engineer, and since we are looking for new technologies, can you please tell me what is evapogeochemistry and what is biogeochemistry? And can we figure out from space how we can use them?
Wow. Okay, that's a cool question to lead off with. Biogeoevapochemistry. So there's so many different areas that touches on that have all seen like explosive growth in the last 2 decades, let's say, right? Like on the bio side of things, we've heard about now how you can program enzymes and program even cells to make new things for us, whether that's a vaccine that's going to protect us from, increasingly, hopefully not, but being realistic, disease in the future, to fuels, to food products, to so many different things, and tying that together with the inputs, right? So in the chemistry, do we have to use sugars, things that are expensive? Can we just shove waste ag stuff or waste other things directly into our bioreactor? Can we shove CO2 in, right? So there's tie-ins with the broader ecosystem of the inputs there. We need to transport them to the site through a pipeline, through trucks. Are those trucks electric, right? Everything starts to connect. And with geology, what are we still getting from the ground? What might be put back into the ground? How are we watching, drawing it back up to space? Is there manufacturing we can do there? Can we use that to monitor what's going on in the ground, in the forests, in our oceans, the productivity of agricultural land? Like these are all things that we're watching and just trying to get our heads around, because there's never been a more exciting time, I think, to be defining longer words of groups of prefixes onto them.
I just had to make sure everybody knows how cool you are. So that's what I am.
Surrounded by cool people. It's not me. Right. It's the
right. That's our business.
People we work with.
But more seriously, so the global carbon cycle, the fact that we don't have the carbon sinks to offset what we're putting out there. How is that going? Has it been getting better or getting worse in terms of the carbon budget? And also, did we learn anything in this kind of little experiment that arguably COVID has been?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So bad news first. Are we doing better? Not quite, right? We're still. The line is still going up, and we need it to go down, right? If you look at that iconic now graph from the IPCC report, we're at the point where we have a real fork, and either we start controlling emissions and going down, or we continue going up into bad space. If you look at the different sectors, 50% of the world's electricity is fossil fuels. The fastest growth in electricity generation is in developing countries, right? So it's not even like we necessarily have control of that knob in some cases. The oceans have been bailing us out. That has been discussed before. Like a third of the CO2 that we've put into the atmosphere has actually been sucked up by the oceans, which is why they're acidifying, and that leads to other issues. But the good news is there's never been more, I think, alignment on that this is a problem. And also the technology, we've just been checking box after box on the ability to electrify, the ability to capture carbon, the ability to utilize our existing knowledge of geology and chemistry to sequester CO2 safely for long periods of time. When we look at the balance of what products are really CO2 intensive, and we look at things like cement and plastics production, we can't actually make enough plastics and cement to use all the CO2 we're putting out. So we really have to do that math and work on the product side, also work on the sequestration side, and also, think creatively. Like I love the reverse the pipeline idea, right? Like we have all this amazing infrastructure that can be utilized, especially in this country and people with those skill sets.
Okay, thank you for that. And as we go forward, we have to extract fossil fuels from transportation and manufacturing and agriculture and, the built environment, everything we do. So a lot of work. I want to go to, let's go, Jiang, could you talk about kind of the energy transition that's going on in China and the commitment to renewables and where that comes from?
Well, thank you, Erika. I'm going to actually share a few slides to make this point. Thank you for inviting me to this very important conference. Many of the panels has talked about the critical connection between climate change and energy security. I want us to talk another dimension, which is the economic opportunity associated with clean energy transition and climate mitigation. We just finished an assessment of this issue in China, and I'd like to share some insight we learned in that process. For many of you in the clean energy space, these are very familiar figures, right? So the cost of solar and energy storage technology has declined over 80% over the last decades, and that have gone down to roughly 60% or so. That creates enormous opportunity for deploying these technologies in many places in the world. Renewable is becoming the cheapest source of power, right? So that's very, very good news for us. So what does this mean, right? So in one of the analysis we've done recently in China, if China simply use the same kind of cost trend as we project globally, that China could actually achieve over 62% clean generation by 2030 in 10 years' time. That including solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, right? All the zero emission technologies. So they actually can turn the dial fairly quickly and at a lower cost than the business as usual scenario, which continue building coal plants. Now, one of the insight from this analysis is that, well, not only the electricity are cheaper, so as people spend less on electricity, what do with the money, right? So they actually go out to buy other products and services. Given the economic consumption are mostly in consumer goods and services. So there's actually a quiet shifting of money within the economy from energy-intensive sector to the service sector, which has much higher job intensity, which means in the service industries, you employ more people, for example, in Starbucks, than digging coal mines. So there's actually tremendous economic benefit of all that. So if you put all this thing together, the flow of the savings through the energy system, economic system, you come up with some rather interesting numbers, right? So in this one assessment we've done recently, by moving on to a fast transition of renewables in the clean power system, China's GDP could be potentially higher between 6 to 7.5% by 2030. And in terms of employment and job growth, roughly 7.7 to 8% higher job growth. So that's actually really positive numbers, right? So, obviously, there will be downside as well, but we also have an enormous upside capture. This number actually are fairly similar to the recent IEA 2050 net zero study, which essentially said, to get on a pathway to net zero by 2050, which is what we need to get to by, according to IPCC, the global GDP might be 4% higher by 2030. So these are rather similar. Whether it's a 6% or 4%, these are positive numbers, right? This is not a negative number. I think this really changed the paradigm. We used to think about anything protecting the environment, it costs us money. And we potentially actually have a growth opportunity, and not only just in terms of GDP, but also in terms of creating more jobs. So I'll just, this is the story I think that's quite important to share with our audience.
That's perfect. Thank you. And the next thing I'm going to ask you about, oh, by the way, the Jobs Act that's being put in place, the Infrastructure Act in the U.S. today, $600 billion, strikes me as a drop in the bucket. Seems to me it should be, 2 or 3 trillion. But anyway, that's a separate conversation. So Jiang, thank you for that. I want to ask you, we're going to talk to Stephanie for a minute, but I'm going to want to ask all of you about a just transition. How do we create, a more, not just regenerative, but inclusive economy? So Stephanie, financial services, my favorite, okay? Now, what's cool is that it seems like there's a confluence of factors that are shifting the dynamics of the capital markets. Finally, we have asset owners and asset managers and investment banks and accountants and exchanges and regulators, lawyers and students and standard setting bodies. Finally, everybody's on the same page to really move towards sustainability, right? We need the force of will. We need better data. We need consistent language, right? We need systems to measure impact, but it's positive, right? Social media, huge transparency, big data, all good. When it comes to financial services institutions, what is the role in financing a better future? And again, given the trust in our institutions having been damaged, talk about the role and maybe partnerships, which we desperately need. So tell us what you guys are up to.
Thank you, Erika. And certainly it's a great question that we run into frequently. The banking industry has a hand in creating part of that climate crisis, right? And now we need to play an active role in fixing it. For me, I believe banks have the opportunity to be at the forefront of climate-based solutions by doing 3 key things. The first is in looking at internal practices and how our actions can influence positive change. Banks in particular have a responsibility to help drive energy transition based on their financing power. Specifically, banks can look at what they are financing and set restrictions around those activities, which are harmful to the planet. In addition, all banks need to be looking at financing companies that are advancing in bringing lower and zero carbon solutions to the global economy, like alternative fuels, renewables, energy storage, and enabling regenerative agriculture and farming. Second is about creating the knowledge base for consumers to support climate-based companies and empowering them to take action. So consumers make decisions every day, right, about where they purchase their daily cup of coffee, clothes, food, or even where they bank. We have an opportunity to bring awareness to the consumer on those daily activities and how they impact their carbon footprint and could support reduction of their own emissions. We can play a role in collaborating with organizations to bring this awareness to light and create systemic change within our communities. And then lastly, I think it's about something you spoke to earlier, partnerships, right? And supporting those organizations that are dedicated to creating positive impact through their programs. And banks have the opportunity to take a comprehensive approach to directly supporting them. For example, Bank of the West has an extensive partnership with Grid Alternatives. This organization dedicates their resources to creating equitable solutions for low-income communities to shift to energy efficiency through solar panel installations. In addition to providing financial support through contributions, I served on the board of directors of their Colorado chapter and was able to witness firsthand their impact that they've had in these communities. For example, they work in tribal communities, not only providing them with a source of electricity for the first time, but also job training opportunities where they might not otherwise be available. It was really a beautiful story to witness. So I think if we want to reach our net zero emission goals, the path includes investments in new and existing technologies, number one. Number two, informing our consumers on how their everyday choices contribute to global emissions. And number three, finding the right partners who are moving the needle when it comes to climate change.
That's perfect, Stephanie. And what you've described is kind of how I think about, Pathstone impact here. It is an ethos, meaning how we think, the air that we breathe, our infrastructure, our culture, innovation, service. It's really an ethos when we talk about impact. And by the way, just for definition for those out there, sustainable investing is the systematic analysis of the critical environmental, social, and governance factors that go into an investment process. Impact investing goes further, and it's about intentionality. It's about additionality. But for your investment, something wouldn't happen. It's about measurability. So we're going to get through these language issues. But, with impact as ethos, we can accelerate things. We can scale initiatives. So, Carly, that question is coming to you next. But first, Jiang, I want to talk about that just transition. Jobs. Ultimately, jobs and education seems like what we need to keep a sustainable economy going. So how do you see that in China? What do we need to do? And frankly, I would suggest that if the emerging world puts in place consumption habits and patterns like the developed world, we're completely, how should I put this, screwed. So, so could you talk about that just transition?
Well, thank you. That's a very important and challenging question. So one thing I want to emphasize that the economic picture we're painting on aggregate are very positive, but it doesn't really mean the impact on each community, each location is the same. Oftentimes they are very, very different. So when we're talking about the impact on community, we really have to go to understand the local condition and constraints. For example, the sister province in China, the Shanxi provinces, has a nice long-term relationship with Wyoming. Both are coal-dominant provinces, right? Shanxi produce a quarter of coal in China. And so the impact on Shanxi province and its coal mining industry are rather different than aggregate impact across the board in China. So I think the number one thing is to understand the local constraint and local challenges and to have that active conversation to not only impose sort of a top-down solution, but to actually understand what is driving people's behavior and choices locally. That's a very long and detailed, oftentimes very involved conversation. 3 summers ago, I actually did a little bit of field survey in the region, talked to coal miners and coal mine owners in both private and in state-owned companies. I mean, everyone's perspective are slightly different, right? So, for example, in the state-owned mines, there's a huge political premium on preventing unemployment. So the state-owned companies will try to shift their workers to other locality and other facilities, right? They might be closing some coal mine here, but they'll try to, shifting worker to different locations. I'll try to set up retraining programs and finding other sort of a service sector employment for their current employees. There are also social benefit programs, which essentially, try to explore out what you can do into natural attrition instead of laying people off. In the private, coal mines, and there's a lot of actually migrant workers, which bring very different kind of challenges, right? So some of the migrant workers might decide to go back to their home province. Some may have more difficulties or finding other local-based employment because they don't really have a local base. So that their needs are slightly different. Suffice to say that this is not an easy question to be answered right away, but I think starting early, engaging with people in local, engaging people on the individual level, particularly per community level, it's actually a good start finding a solution. One thing I would add to that is that there are some modalities you can learn from. Oftentimes, in the coal mining region, there's a fair amount of ecological damages occurred over long decades of mining. So ecological restoration could be actually a very important function and services that will bring capital and employment to the mining regions.
Thank you for that. Recently I heard that every year China plants trees, a forest, larger than the size of France every year. So I thought that was really cool. One, is that true? Two, what else is the kind of coolest, most encouraging project you all have going on? Because I know there's a lot.
Well, planting tree actually is a huge effort on China's part as part of their climate mitigation strategy. It's very specifically mentioned in the National Climate Mitigation Plan. The other part I thought was really cool is that the private sector is really driving the deployment of renewable technologies. Solar, wind are largely produced by private firms in China, and they are going gangbusters in terms of scaling up the technology and creating innovation along the supply chains, not just the solar cell or that convert the energy to power, but also the entire supply chain, how it is created to make it easy for consumer to use it and at a lower cost. One of the coolest product recently I saw was a double-sided solar panel that's being used. The concept is actually very simple, right? So you have one side of the solar panel can capture solar ray already, and you have a metal frame, you have all the material. You simply need to put another layer of solar on the other side to capture the reflection and other angles of light. It actually boosts the efficiency another 20-25%, but it's very low cost increase. So that's not for your rooftop, but in many other central solar applications, actually it's a huge booster in terms of energy produced with the same amount of footprint. I thought that was pretty cool.
That's totally cool. I recently heard actually that a problem we've got is that solar panels are being chucked into landfills when they still have huge capacity. So we have to figure out that, which is going to be my next question to you actually on efficiency. All right. Now, Stephanie, before I come to you, because I really want to understand how philanthropy is transferring to impact investing, right, and allowing catalytic capital to come in. So hold that. And Carly, let's talk about scalability. What are the most scalable technologies and solutions that we can really get going?
Oh, gosh, there's a lot that's really just starting to take off. And I think taking a couple examples from our portfolio, we work with a vertical farming company called Upward Farms, right, which is rapidly deploying these vertical in-house greenhouses effectively, where you can reduce the fertilizer use, reduce pesticide use, really control your water use. Some of the soil science that's coming out, like that also increases yield. So all of a sudden you can grow this wonderful, healthy produce right by where you're going to use it. Going back to a just transition, and there's many other topics we could touch on there, but food deserts and scarcity, that's another thing that you can start addressing when you create a more distributed supply chain, which is one of the things we're looking at. I think the next decade is going to be the decade of the shipping container. Literally, half of the companies we talk to can now get all of their chemical plant that used to take up an entire city block in Houston, all the parts fit into a shipping container. So you can get it to a site, set it up in weeks instead of months. And that goes for, technologies really across the board, from lithium extraction so if you think about batteries, right? If we want to electrify everything, we're going to need a lot of batteries. If we wanted to just electrify passenger transport, we need to produce 30 times more lithium than we currently do around the world. So all the people who are really great at geology and mining, there's a lot of need for everybody still. That's one scalable, like interesting scalable thing. When you talk about solar, Jiang's example with the panels, there are still ways where you implement just a slight tweak to the process of wafer manufacturing, and all of a sudden you could produce twice as many wafers from the same ingot, right? And purifying silicon. I don't know if people are aware, that's like a 1500 C degree process, right? So there's carbon emissions in that can be avoided. So back to your question on scalability, I think across agriculture, across manufacturing, across transport and energy, there's a lot of things that are changing with modularization, with local sourcing, and with the simulation thing that Chris touched on earlier, where all of a sudden you don't need to build 50 units, each twice as big as the next to get to the big size. I think really you can't pick one technology that's become more scalable, because they all have, because you don't need to run as many experiments. It's been really mind-blowing.
Thank you for that. I understand also in some places those shipping containers are actually being used for housing in part of the emerging world. That's pretty cool. Jiang, just so you know, I am going to come back to you on nuclear, talking about modularity. I'm curious about that. A few people are, if it's in the mix. Okay, so Stephanie, talk to us about, again, catalytic capital. What are you seeing in terms of, the asset owners and driving capital towards sometimes, higher risk? But what's the magnitude of that shift going on from philanthropy to impact, if you see it?
Well, I can't speak to, that's a great question. I can't speak to specifically what Bank of the West is doing to support climate action and how our specific innovative products that we're offering now and the partnerships that we have are driving for more of that sustainable future. So, at Bank of the West, we are a fundamentally different bank where we lead with sustainability and diversity. We've launched a 1% for the Planet account that lets customers track the CO2 impact of their purchases and then donates 1% of that net revenue from the account to environmental nonprofits, all at no cost to the customer. Since inception of that account, it's made up a significant portion of our new account openings, which proves to us that customers want sustainable finance products. Bank of the West has also made $1 billion commitment to finance clean and efficient renewable energy within 5 years. And I'm so excited to share with you today that we are close to reaching that goal 2 years ahead of time, which is just super cool. Recently, our parent company, BNP Paribas, joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance, an initiative to align our lending and investment portfolios with transition strategies to help the world reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And then lastly, I spoke to you before partnerships, right? And they're key in driving that climate change action. And I'm proud to say that Bank of the West is the first and only US bank to partner with 1% for the Planet, Protect Our Winters, and Conservation Alliance, whose missions are centered around environmental preservation and protecting our planet for us and generations to come. It truly takes a village to create the systemic change we need to drive not only climate change awareness, but also the innovative solutions. And now, as mentioned before in your original question, Erika, now is the time we need to bring those partnerships together to build that sustainable future for everybody.
That's cool. I should tell you, just a little ad for you. I've worked pretty closely with BNP's sustainability team.
Awesome.
And while the team was looking at, the extent to which BNP was financing, was trying to not finance fossil fuel companies. This is like 10 years ago. There were other banks that were financing, slicing the tops off mountains to get into the coal. So BNP,
wow.
I think BNP has been very progressive on that. So say hi to my friends over there.
I will. Thanks, Erika.
So let's talk about nuclear for a moment, because in sustainable investing and impact investing, you're rarely allowed to utter those words. And as part of the, transition, the energy mix, Jiang, what do you think we should know about nuclear?
Well, that's the question actually for any technology who has to win the technology competition, right? So it's very difficult to know which one will win out in the end. But the cost, the safety issue are probably very important for nuclear technology to have to pass that test to succeed, because it's not only the technology itself, whether it works or not. You really have to compete with other technology who can do the same thing, right? So we want durable power, and we want dispatchable power. And whether you can deliver that is a question actually for all the new technology to compete on that. So put that way, we don't, I personally don't have a position on that. I think as long as you can meet this requirement of economics, safety, and scalability, and that technology will win eventually in the end. So it's really the sort of benchmark we have to set for technology to jump over the hurdle.
Okay, the cost of the safety. Carly, you were nodding your head. Tell me what you're thinking about nuclear.
Yeah, nuclear is something that we've spent a lot of time looking at, and me personally, one of my first jobs out of college was creating technologies to help nuclear plants off safer and longer and more efficiently. Traveled around the world doing that at several nuclear plants, and I think that there's real potential there for a shift in how we think about nuclear, right? Like I think like Jiang said, the critical piece is, can it compete on cost? That's one of many critical pieces, and I think we've looked at plants that really show a line to less than $5 or $50 a megawatt hour. Let's use those units, right? And that's deployed, right? So when you look at solar and wind at certain times of day in certain geographies, like yes, you can get them so cheap, and it's amazing. And we still need to replace half the world's electricity, and we need to build out the grid to support that. And while we're doing all those things, I think it's really important that we get started right now on building things that we know we can build, that we utilize existing grid infrastructure, that we look at the retirements of coal plants and nuclear plants that are going to happen in the next 40 years and backfill accordingly. And I think it would be a real shame to overlook nuclear, and not even just a real shame, but like a huge missed opportunity to overlook nuclear in that mix. I think we've come like an astronomical way on safety in terms of the number of parts needed to maintain that, in terms of how we think about fuel, how we protect it. And I just think it's like an amazing opportunity for essentially unlimited power that doesn't take up land, that doesn't require water to a great extent. And you can, like modularization, you can do small, you can do big. I would love for everybody to take a tour of a local nuclear plant, because there's just so much potential.
Some of my clients, most of them would say, not over my dead body. So, but
I understand this. And, my parents lived near a nuclear plant for a decade, and I've worked in them. And it's like people don't think twice about living along shipping channels where the emissions are quite scary. But, a coal plant has higher mercury emissions than like a nuclear plant, or higher radioactivity. More radioactivity comes from a coal power plant than comes from a nuclear plant. People may not realize that. But that's just one perspective that I'm very happy to discuss with people.
Thank you for that. I have some introductions to make. So that's one thing that people don't realize. And I think, Jiang, back to you for a second. I think people may not realize methane and the challenges of methane and the impact versus CO2. Could you say a word about that? I know you've thought a lot about that.
Right. So methane is the second largest greenhouse gas in the world, contributing actually huge to the warming itself. Methane, mostly because it's much more effective in trapping the heat than CO2. So it also it's in every sector, right? So in oil and gas, in coal mining, you have a lot of methane leakage, but also in agriculture, both in the livestock industry, and also growing rice. That produces a lot of methane as well. In waste sector, both landfill and wastewater. So they're actually a huge, diverse source of emission. It is actually contributing a lot more to so-called near-term warming than the long-term warming, because methane has a shorter lifetime, roughly a dozen years in the air, and it goes away. So actually contributed more to the near-term warming. So if you look at that, particularly in the 20-year lifetime framework, methane is actually over 80% more effective in trapping heat. So reducing methane is actually very critical in saving us some time to figure out some long-term solution to get to net zero by 2050 or so. But we need to actually take much more aggressive action on methane in the next 10 years so we have enough time to deploy other technology down the road.
Thank you for that. Again, I think it's something that in legislation is not well understood. Can we switch the idea of, Stephanie, you guys think a lot about communities. And so, I think a lot about cities. So could you say a word about kind of what you're seeing in terms of financing smart cities? Have you seen anything particularly exciting? Because it seems to me like, why can't I walk around on the sidewalks of New York City where they absorb like that energy from me and recycle it? Doesn't that seem like it'd be easy to do? So, so Stephanie, what are you seeing in smart cities? And then Carly and Jiang, maybe you have some thoughts.
Sure. I think that financial institutions are constantly evaluating what those types of opportunities are to support sustainable cities. And so for Bank of the West, we have launched our ESG vertical for Bank of the West. And so I know that they're looking at those types of products and innovations to be able to deploy in our cities to get them to, those greener environmentally friendly buildings and infrastructure. So Bank of the West has launched their ESG vertical, and I'm hopeful that we will have some additional products and services that we'll be able to deploy in our cities. But I think it's constant innovation that we seek. And I know financial institutions have their pulse in terms of what the support system looks like.
Thank you. Carly, what would you add to that?
For smart cities, I think there's so much potential there, especially somebody who has a lot of family in Houston watching what happened in February, for just understanding the grid better and having localized sensing and metering so you know where the hospitals are, and you can, if something were to happen, you can isolate areas in a more just and in a more distributed way and recover really fast, and also see where the problems are. So I think from a grid-wide standpoint, there's a lot of opportunity in the smart meters and smart control of the grid strategy. In terms of buildings too, you see a lot of companies with smart sensors for who's in rooms, who's not in rooms, what is the right temperature for things to be, how do you tint the windows so you can actually save 10 degrees or more in a room by adjusting that throughout the day. In terms of water and having all of our water right now, anything that goes down anywhere has to go through a wastewater plant. Can you use gray water, like things that you washed your hands in or isn't really all that dirty, and reprocess that on site? So there's just a lot more our buildings could do for us to get us closer to the Jetsons than we are today, and I'm excited to see more of that in the future.
But sometimes people don't want to talk about stuff we have to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about toilet to tap. The reality is we have to talk about it, right?
Yeah. Well, and we don't, even halfway, right? Like the toilet, okay, that's a little bit of a hard problem. You can have one unit for the easy stuff and one unit for the toilet. And, there's a lot of energy in that you could use. Just saying.
Just saying. You got to talk about it. Jiang, what would you add on this subject?
So I never really liked the term smart cities. I'm not sure what that really means. And to me, the city we want to build is a more livable city that's more human friendly to the citizens, right? Whether you can have a more walkable neighborhood, get more access to public transit, you can have all the services nearby. You don't have to drive, so far. Houston being one of the extreme example, the other side. What are we looking for? So I think, the design principle for a livable city is actually, well enshrined. We just haven't really been doing that, right? So in most of Northern European cities, like Copenhagen, Stockholm, the principle of livable city is very well practiced. We know a lot about that already. In terms of livable buildings, there are also a lot of new innovation in recent years that the building can be so-called alive in the sense that not only consume resource from the nature, but also actually give back to nature. So, not only they have net zero building from the south, but also zero waste, I have a friend who built a building in Seattle that not only is zero energy, is net zero water, net zero waste. In the end of the day, every 2 weeks, they have a truck from city park department to take all the compost from their building, so it's a commercial building, as a fertilizer for the parks. So, those things actually are, you have practical solutions to be deployed. The question again is, are we seizing the moment to do it or not?
So that was a perfect segue to another question. Then we're going to open it up to participants here. But that vision of humanity for our cities is really beautiful. And I'll ask each of you, what kind of one vision would be as we make progress. For me, I would argue that a circular economy, which you just described, one day I would like to see that there is not even a concept of waste. That would be really beautiful. Carly, what would a vision for the future be? You had to pick one.
Oh gosh, I would love for things to just be more integrated. So when you look at a city block, you see solar on the roofs, you see if it's on the coast, you've got that playing in and tidal energy. If it's up in the mountains, maybe you have some pumped energy storage or some other, geothermal happening. And that is out and displayed in front of people so everybody can see the amazing things that are going on. It's not hidden off an electric box somewhere, but you actually have some of the technologies from energy generation to waste collection to the agriculture side of things, not hidden away, but out in view of the public. And so as you walk around, you can see the whole community and all the pieces that are sustaining life out there and doing what they should. I think we hide technology a lot, and I would like to see less of that as we get even better at it.
That's beautiful. That's impact as ethos, Stephanie, quick vision statement.
Thank you, Erika. For me, on the philanthropic side, that's where I see the opportunity to create equitable solutions for all communities to participate in energy efficiency measures, and that we don't just single it out to communities that can afford that type of investment. So we know that all communities have those opportunities, whether it's through financial institutions or whether it's through community-based organizations, that they're made aware of those opportunities and can practice them.
Perfect. So trillions of dollars of catalytic capital. Jiang?
So I think you really hit one of the key concepts, which is the circular economy. How mentally with nature, right? How do we use all the resource that to the fullest extent possible? One of the concepts we have to get used to is sufficiency, not affluence, right? Oftentimes with affluence, we tend to just buy our way out of a problem without thinking through all its consequences, percolations of the impact. So if we can simply take a little time to thinking through all the connection we create or disrupt, we will find more integrated solutions, as Carly mentioned earlier. So we have much more holistic approach for solving both our environmental problem, but also more inclusive approach, as more in tune with nature.
That's great. Yeah. I believe that there is a special secret moderator behind looking for questions for you guys. Do we have any questions out there?
Not special, not secret, but yeah, I'm definitely here. This has been a fantastic discussion. Really enjoying it, and the questions that are coming in, I think people are really interested in the circular economy as the tail end of where the tail end of that conversation was going. A couple of comments about it, and specifically, somebody asks, is the circular economy possible without a social shift towards less capital accumulation and consumption? So I don't know if we could just sort of tee that up to the group, or I can read it again. Circular economy possible without a social shift towards less capital accumulation and consumption?
I would say yes, but it's going to be hard, First, you need the inclusion and the scalable solutions, and then people can become maybe less stressed in every area. And then we can realize that, the human capital and social capital are as or more valuable than financial capital. So with me, it's a yes, but a worried yes.
I think that you are exactly right, Erika, on putting a few words before capital. It's human capital, social capital, natural capital. The only financial capital is actually generated so many times by depleting other capitals. Right? So we need to restore that. We need a proper price signal. We actually value those other capitals. With nature, what's the cost of clean air? Once we put a dollar sign on that, I think the system could be properly aligned. There are sort of a lot of wealth creation in the circular economy itself by capturing the waste, making into usable product. Or waste to energy is a very common phenomenon that's being used. I actually remember reading about one waste to energy power plant in Sweden, which is actually are getting all the garbage from major European cities and making a profit at that because they're able to process into energy and getting paid for because other cities don't have the using landfill for that. Right? So that's only one example of that.
I think it's totally possible. And this is why. On one hand, I think that there actually are a lot more resources on Earth than we are using or could ever use in terms of energy coming from the sun and chemical energy stored. So I think we are approaching a place where energy could become almost free. So if we are really smart and we deploy things really well and thinking about circular economy, we're like biocomposting places are most successful is when you do it in a stadium or somewhere where the same, nothing leaves the system, right? So if you start thinking about what systems and small towns and communities are great places to start doing this, I would love to see more grants and works and projects there where all of the cups in a city become compostable. Okay, well, all of a sudden, then that's really easy. I think for that kind of thing to start happening, you really need to level the playing field, like you're saying, Jiang, on the cost of capital or cost of carbon. Like if you level the playing field, if you think about what happened with acid rain, right? Like we actually addressed that fairly well, I believe. Once there were limits set, and everybody had to play by the same rules. I think, especially with carbon, if you look across the ecosystem and back to the circular economy, some things, maybe gasoline here, maybe something else there. There's an implicit carbon or explicit carbon tax in California on that, but it's not across the board. So I think step one is leveling the playing field, and if you do that, then you can start taking little bites of the apple in communities to make that happen. And I think you could get to the place where you have enough energy and enough resources that we can do some pretty amazing things. Like everybody should be able to have the resources to live a pretty amazing life. That's a lot of optimism, but.
Terrific. Another question coming in from Lucas Haynes, going back to the investment side of things. The David Rockefeller Fund is a decarbonizing signatory of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, and I'm curious how any panelist thinks the net zero investor movement is accelerating the decarbonizing transition.
Stephanie, you want to take it or shall I?
Go ahead, Erika.
I think it absolutely is accelerating the progress. And by the way, you use the word movement. It is kind of a movement. But what's interesting, and now down on the ground, what we see, and this is not just catalytic capital and philanthropic services and divestment, but this is also corporate engagement. As an example, I have not seen an RFP for investment advisory work from an institution that doesn't have questions about climate, about diversity, about research. Everybody is putting forth at least interest, at least curiosity for sustainable and impact investing. And so it's exploded in terms of looking for advisory propositions and solutions and strategies. The issue we have with impact and sustainable investment kind of exploding is that there is a lot of kind of greenwashing out there and tagging of sustainable and impact solutions. And so what we have to do, what we do, is analyze these managers and strategies all day long to see where the real stuff is. And so that's the good and the bad of the movement for sustainable and impact investing when it comes to climate. But definitely, I hate to use the word inflection point because there's like two people ever that pick the inflection point. But I think we're as close to having some kind of an inflection point, with the acceleration of our kind of investing for a sustainable future. So, Stephanie?
If I would add to that comment, not only just sustainable investing, but also actually understand the carbon risk in your portfolio, right? As technology have a tectonic shift, a lot of your old portfolio would have a huge amount of carbon risk involved, right? I mean, part of the analysis we've done just on the power side, a lot of coal power plant will be not competitive in the future as so much low cost or zero marginal cost solar when it come online that you're going to lose a lot of generational hours. So it become a huge liability. Now for the financial world to understand the inherent risk already in the portfolio, figure out a strategy to manage that risk is also another major step in this transition to a clean zero carbon investment strategy.
And like we said before, there's no place to hide, right? Every industry, every company, you can talk about literally tens of trillions of dollars, present value of dollars destroyed as climate change accelerates, so that there's no place to hide, and there shouldn't be like tornadoes in Brooklyn. Like that's not okay. So this is a real impact.
Absolutely. A question for the Bank of the West. What is the Bank of the West specifically doing to reduce their carbon footprint and become carbon neutral?
Okay, so we get this question a lot. And I know I spoke to what banks should be doing internally. And so I'll talk to what Bank of the West is doing to reduce their own carbon footprint. So I'm proud to say Bank of the West has been carbon neutral in its operations since 2017. And we're committed to maintain that status through reducing our energy consumption, using renewable sources, and offsetting any residual emissions from our operations. So we understand while the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impacts, such as remote work and travel restrictions, contributed to the decreases in the bank's overall greenhouse gas emissions, we're continuing to work on efficiency measures in our operations and buildings, encouraging low carbon mobility and consolidating and enhancing workspace efficiencies. We recognize carbon neutrality is not just a milestone, but a continuous journey in supporting our environment, and we will continue to adopt energy efficient models for improvements within our own operations. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.